Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Scott Schilling, and welcome to Scott Schilling Speaks. I'm going to talk a little bit about something that, quite frankly, everybody needs to know about if they don't. My guest today, Dr. Matt Flory. Matt, thanks for joining me here on Scott Schilling Speaks.
Scott, thanks so much for having me. I'm
You
looking
know,
forward to it.
I want to share the whole concept about inflammation being the most common component to chronic disease. Hard to believe that it can all be trailed back to one thing, but give us the foundation of this and then we'll kind of unpack it as we go.
Sure thing. Well, this is something, kind of a tidbit of information that I came across as I was doing a lot of questioning and really looking at outcomes across my client base. And the foundation of it really comes from peer-reviewed medical journal studies that, depending on which one you're looking at, reported in these studies is that anywhere from 75 to 90% of all of the diagnoses that appear in the diagnostic catalogs have a foundation that's resting upon inflammation, meaning that inflammatory state is driving those conditions.
That's absolutely phenomenal when I first heard that a while ago. But again, so any things we're talking about, whether it be, basically it's the contributing factor to, like you say, 80 to 95% of all chronic illness. What would a chronic illness be that's tied to inflammation?
Sure thing. So you've got everything from diabetes, and we may even, get to a point where we touch upon a little bit more of the explanation of some of these to a degree, but you've got everything from your diabetes to cancer, right? And then all of your autoimmune conditions, certainly, but things like anxiety, depression, right? These all fall within that world. Certainly your pain disorders. One thing I frequently tell clients is that swollen things tend to hurt more frequently, right? So those that have, yeah, exactly. Honestly, Scott, none of this is rocket science. It's a different way of looking at it, right? And it's kind of acknowledging some of this from a different perspective, but none of it's rocket science, right? So yeah, swollen things tend to hurt better. So you got everything from, your person that tends to get some knee pain, some hip pain, low back, neck, shoulder with some frequency, right? Kind of a chronic condition, to those with more ongoing chronic and even intense pain, like a fibromyalgia or some of these other pain disorders.
So how do we go about, if we finally recognize that it's inflammation, can that inflammation be reduced or eliminated?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's multiple different inflammatory pathways. And so there's a variety of objective measurements of tests, approaches that can be used to evaluate those. But absolutely, we've got to remember that inflammation is our body's kind of generic, almost first line of protective defense, right? It is what's called on regardless of whether we have say, exposure with a toxin or an infection, or maybe we just twisted our ankle a bit, right? Inflammation is common to those situations, right? So what it becomes about from my perspective, and with kind of this cause-based approach, which looks at inflammation as, yes, underlying all of these conditions or diseases or symptomatic profiles, but then we look as to what's causing the inflammation, right? One of the things I frequently will say to people is, isn't that really what your doctor should be charged with doing, right? They should be looking for those causes, potentially, rather than manipulating some of the symptoms and things on the top. So as we look at, what's underlying and what's causing those, we can then start to go a bit deeper.
So what are the underlying causes of creating the inflammation. I mean, as a multi-sport athlete growing up, I certainly twisted plenty of ankles and knees and body parts, and that's somewhat understandable that the body would then swell to take care of that joint and do something like that. But what are the things that we don't commonly know or address, that are the causes of inflammation?
Right, right. Well, humans as a living thing are constantly adapting, right? So one of the ways I like to frame this is depending on those influences on our body, we're going to be adapting in, say, a healthy or a positive way versus the other way, right? Versus the opposite. And so my conversation with people really becomes one about what's in your environment, right? What are those driving factors? And so now we talk about nutrition, right? We talk about stress levels. We talk about, physical activity and on down the line. Okay. We get back into maybe a more normal way of framing the conversation. So if it all becomes about how our body's adapting and this interface between our body and the environment, now we're getting somewhere, right? And so what we see is that, again, at this interface, at this connection of our environment with our body's tissue, we have this immune system, okay? And the immune system is most of these interfaces where we do have issues that arise as a source of this inflammation. This tissue that houses it and the tissue that is there is like our skin. It's called epithelium, right? So we have this epithelial tissue, obviously on the outer parts of our body, but also all the way through our respiratory system, okay? All the way through our digestive system. And we get similar types of expressions of these systems when any of them is triggered or irritated, kind of, taken beyond that physiologic norm, and inflammation is starting to express. This is why you find from somebody with my perspective, a huge commonality, a causal relationship really between things like respiratory allergies or sinus infections and irritation of that sinus tissue chronically, along with microbiome issues, because they're similar tissues, similar types of immune system, and they will react in a similar fashion when they are presented with a challenge, an invader, a stressor, right? And again, this stressor could be a physical injury as much as it could be a yeast or fungal overgrowth in the gut. So there's this crossover, and what we get is that these stressors tend to compound on each other to a degree that immune barrier that's been kind of holding the line is overcome to a degree. And this is where we say that the tissues start to get leaky.
So is this, one of the things that obviously many people don't realize, leaky gut is a huge contributing factor to inflammation. True?
That's right. In fact, if you look at, let's just say it like this, passed back and forth through our profession as a provider, it's basically accepted that if you have an autoimmune condition, there's a 100% chance you should be taking a look at your gut and fixing a leaky gut situation and the inflammation coming.
So that's really where the microbiome comes in, or that's one of the starting contributors, correct?
Absolutely. Microbiome is extremely important here. And there's ways that, it's obvious to us at this point, the magnitude of its influence on our body, when I think the going, ratio right now is, 9 or 10 microbiome bacteria for every cell of the human body, right? It's overwhelming how, what that ratio is. And its influence on our body and especially on our immune system. I mean, even, cool little anecdotal tidbits like For so long, people have thought that that appendix, right, there in the large intestine is removable, right? And it's largely inconsequential as to whether it's there or not. When we find out that our appendix is really like a thermostat for our immune system, and it collects our microbiome organisms, and then our immune system is able to read that and respond, right? So it's very, interesting facts about this that have really been coming to light as we learn more and more about that microbiome.
So what are the things that can be done to, start to heal your body? The only thing that heals the body is the body. So how do we take care of the body to start making better decisions? What better decisions could we make?
Yeah, sure. Well, again, if we look back to this this principle of our body will adapt to our environment, we end up finding that our health outcome ends up relying about 80% on that environment and only about 20% on our genetics, right? And that's a rough number, right? Yeah. But point being is that obviously the point being that we know that environmental influence is paramount, right? So the problem that people find themselves in when this has gone, we've been trained really to not pay attention to some of the initial signs and symptoms, and we've maybe been taught to treat them, over the counter, whether that's naturally or through, with over the counter pharmaceuticals, and we get to a point at which the problem can have compounded. So early on, right? Early on, microbiome support in health might look like some fiber or prebiotics, right? It might look like some probiotics, okay, to help balance that out. But the deeper and deeper you get into it, those things stop having as much of an impact as deeper complications have compounded in the situation, right? So once you are into a leaky gut situation, you literally now have, on the human side, right, your immune system being bombarded with things that it never should come into contact with, right? It's like leaving your back door open all night, right? Chances are nobody's going to come in, but you want to leave it, leave it up to that chance. And so now we have some, probably poor digestion, because a GI with a microbiome that's off tends to have, problems digesting proteins and maybe absorbing our fats and these sorts of things. So now we're getting undigested food particles that have access to the bloodstream and the immune system. That starts to get triggered. We start to get triggered immune reactions to food. Okay. We also, as a complication of this going on, these organisms, yeast, fungus, bacteria, live in a biofilm, which is the same exact thing that you see on the top of a pond as pond scum. Okay, it's what you brush off your teeth. Okay, these biofilms, they're natural. Not all of them are even what I want to say, not all of them even really trigger your immune system, so to speak, but certainly the organisms that are infectious to our bodies, those biofilms have toxic effects on our body. So, early on, some of the typical things that you commonly have heard of, right? This probiotics, the diet, fiber, these sorts of things, that's when they can be kind of employed a little bit more effectively. Once you get down that road, you may find that probiotics don't quite do it completely, right? You may find that fiber, it helps, but is it fixing the problem? Well, no, it's helping me be much better, making me much more comfortable, but it's not fixing it. Okay, well, then you may have progressed, right, to one of these things where we have to go in and start to actually fight an infection going on in the gut, right? That's kind of a second or upper level strategy that might have to be employed to get this fixed. And once things like that are taken care of, which could be a bacterial pathogen, could be a parasite, right? Find in probably about 20% of people I test single cellular parasites. And a number of those are linked with things like type 1 diabetes and certainly other gastrointestinal disorders and whatnot. But so we fight those infections. We might have to then fix that gut tissue so that the immune system is no longer being exposed to the food or organisms or these sorts of things that were triggering it. And once we have that tissue healed, then we can reestablish proper immune system and, what we might call a rebalancing of the immune system and microbiome and just kind of that gut environment. And then once we're there, we either, if there has been a long-standing leaky gut, we may do a screen on the systemic, the internal immune system to see, okay, did any organisms literally get into the body with biofilm? Right? A lot of these chronic cardiovascular and autoimmune cases have this component where there are infections in the body that we have to then go and clear that sort of a thing out. And one of the reasons we have to do that is because the downstream effects, right, of this whole thing, because we have major implications on things like our adrenal health, which that's where once the adrenals and our circadian rhythm is involved, this is where we get into issues, hormonal problems for males and females, like low T and hormonal imbalances that make menstrual cycles or perimenopause uncomfortable, right, to the female. Or we get issues with say vertigo or low blood pressure, or we get issues with cholesterol and diabetes. That's the adrenals is where we start to, again, the downstream effects of that is where we start to get into some of those issues.
It absolutely, it intrigues me on one side, but it amazes me on the other side that you just shared something, vertigo could be caused because of inflammation or leaky gut. Leaky gut is really just the process of the lining of the intestines becoming so thin that food particles, waste, stuff that's not supposed to escapes, gets into other areas that can be absorbed in the bloodstream and can then kind of wreak havoc on our systems. But to hear things like, I don't think common sense would say, oh gosh, if I have leaky gut, I could have vertigo. Mm-hmm. Or, there's so many different maladies that are all caused by leaky gut.
Yeah.
I think the old statement is most of your health is caused in the gut.
Yeah, right? Yeah. This is really where it gets very interesting, because, just to be real brief about it, I could quickly cite two different ways that vertigo could be an outcome of a symptom. It's not even the same process all the time, right? There's a lot of autoimmune vertigo where literally an immune response, right, to tissue in the brainstem, okay, where the brainstem's maintaining and holding that balance, that could be a cause of vertigo. Another reason is when adrenal fatigue or the adrenals are over hyper functioning, they're called on to be functioning in an elevated fashion chronically, right, drawn out consistently. Then we can get a lowering of the amount of a hormone that our adrenals produce that helps to raise our blood pressure. And that may sound weird, but what happens is that hormone, when we stand up from a seated or a lying down position, that hormone is intended in that moment that we rise to contract and constrict the blood vessels so we keep some blood in our head, for goodness sakes, right? And then to rush all to our legs and feet. Again, very logical, right? Very logical. But when this whole system in the adrenals is worn down, right? Worn out, then we don't have as much of that hormone that allows us to keep that blood distribution when we change positions proper. And so we get all the blood rushing from our head, and now you're woozy for a few minutes, right? So
I had never heard that before, and just had a family member have some vertigo, and would never have put the two together in the very least. Now, a variety of other, joint stiffness, things like that, absolutely. But it's just amazing how far this issue reaches.
Absolutely. And probably the most surprising thing is when you understand how closely these things we're talking about and chronic inflammation are related to high cholesterol, right? And insulin resistance, right? Loss of control of blood sugar. The adrenals and the thyroid hormones are the gas and the brakes for our metabolism. So if you have an issue with the adrenals, with the brakes, you're going to have an issue with the other one, right? They're not going to have this, this good balance. So, now you're talking about metabolism issues and being overweight, right? We're not losing weight like we want. There's a huge issue. Okay. The more cortisol we need to put out inflammation, right? We hear our athletes getting cortisone injections to control inflammation and pain. Well, that whole strategy they got from our body's natural way of producing cortisone, right? Cortisol, when they're using cortisone. So we have this, when there is an increased demand for that end product. And I often use an analogy of like a paper factory, right, Scott? If we need more paper, well, then we're going to have to maybe increase the shift, right? Increase the shifts and the hours of the workers and the factories open, but we have to have more raw materials too, right? And for the whole inflammation concept, the paper is the cortisol, the anti-inflammatory, the recovery hormone, what helps us recover from stress, whether it's stress or whether it's an infection stress, right? I twisted my knee running, right? That kind of stress, right? But anyway, so we have this increased demand for cortisol to help recover from stress. Well, it's going to need more of trees. We're going to need more raw material. Well, guess what that raw material is for cortisol, Scott?
It's probably fat, isn't it?
It's a cholesterol. It's cholesterol, right? And so you literally have a situation where you're right. The body's responding to a stimulus. It's producing more cholesterol, and our cholesterol in our bloodstream goes up because there's a demand for anti-inflammatory recovery in our body. Okay. And right. And the even more interesting aspect of this is that cholesterol is converted in part, okay, so some of the biochemical steps there of its conversion towards the end product cortisol happens at the mitochondrial membrane, right? The more inflammation we have, the worse, I should say, the worse mitochondrial health we have. And so the poorer that conversion. Well, Harvard debunked the concept a decade or plus ago that a high cholesterol in our body is associated with our diet. They debunked that, right? What they found in their research was that at most 20% of our blood cholesterol, the total cholesterol number, 20% of that is due to our diet, can be attributed to us absorbing it in our diet. 80% of it is this cholesterol production, right? As a demand from what our body biochemically needs, and our liver produces it, right? So it puts an added tax upon our liver just to get all this done.
Well, this is the first time that I've ever heard the correlation between cortisol and cortisone, which you would have thought I would have figured out a long, long time ago. But I know that too much cortisol in the body also doesn't allow you to release fat. It kind of it's a protective mechanism against stress, right?
Yeah. That elevated cortisol, it's an antagonist and affects the function of other hormones like insulin, right? And then with kind of what you're saying, gets into leptin and ghrelin and some of these that modulate our hunger and our satiation response, right? So here's what we're saying, right? When you have some reason that your inflammation is high, right? Well, now it doesn't just stop with effects on your adrenal glands, because that can start to affect your sleep. Your circadian rhythm can go off, right? Your metabolism can get sluggish, so it can be difficult to lose weight. The increased cortisol is literally an antagonist for insulin, so now your blood sugar can start going up, right? Your cholesterol is going to be high, because your body's demanding more, your liver produce more cholesterol to help put out the fires of inflammation in the body, right? I mean, what bigger list of problems that is typical in today's day and age, right? And this is what cause-based medicine is, right? This is the concept. This is the concept that, hey, we don't just go in and because we have some of these symptoms, we don't just go in and only treat the adrenal glands. Why? Because like we were saying, all these diagnoses and all these symptoms and conditions, like you said, they filter down to one thing, this inflammation, but that also filters back out to, all right, do we have, is it really the microbiome, right? What is the unique situation in that gut that's causing the inflammation? One of the other top mechanisms for these barriers to be breaking down or the body to become leaky is the gums, right? Either dental work that's gone bad or root canals that have become infected, poor dentition in the first place. They're even finding, Scott, the gingivitis bacteria in the plaques of Alzheimer's. You talk about a direct route, right, from the external world into our body and how it influences us. There's another great example.
Just phenomenal. Would never have thought about. The more I learn about this, the more it fascinates me, because there are holistic treatments, holistic ways. There are things, once this is identified within you, that can be prescribed, that are non-chemical, that are natural, right? That can aid our body in doing the healing that it needs.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. My best recommendations and the way I work with clients is that we go deep, right? We're going for these causes, and those can be in some different places. We mentioned, microbiome and inflammation. There's some detoxification issues and toxicities that can be rolled in there and associated. We haven't really even got into some of that yet, right? It really becomes a exercise in laying the groundwork for the foundation, digging as deep as we can go, and then helping somebody feel as comfortable as possible while they kind of get themselves out of this mess. Because as you can imagine, those gingivitis bacteria in the plaques of Alzheimer's, those aren't easy to get out of there necessarily, right?
No,
but
you would
can
think
it be done? Yes. Yeah, can it be done? Yes, but it isn't always, an overnight thing, right? So you have to kind of lay out a logical strategy, gather your information that you need to make some important decisions on what the process is going to look like, and then really support somebody in establishing that environment so that they're going to adapt towards health.
Wow. Amazing the things that we need to know that we probably don't know, and really appreciate you jumping on. Hard to believe we've run through our time. How do people get a hold of you to learn more and get to work with you?
Absolutely, absolutely. So luckily, we're not trying to hide from anybody. So we've got our team's called Functional Health Team, and we are online. So you can find us at functionalhealthteam.com. Good places to connect with us with that. Our phone number is posted. You can use the Start Now contact kind of form there. And that'll go right into our email accounts. We're also, also on Facebook and Instagram and those sorts of things. So
awesome. Well, I greatly appreciate you coming on here, Dr. Matt, and we'll have to do it again.
It was a lot of fun. I've had so much fun getting to know you and talking with you, and today was certainly no exception. So
well, I appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us here on Scott Schilling Speaks. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time. God bless.